Hi kids, it's Patty here. Hope you're doing great. I know it's been a long time having to stay at home, but I hope you're doing well. Each Wednesday night evening we read a chapter from a series for Patch the Pirate Club about the Willow Valley kids. This is a fictional story about a group of Christian friends who are always looking for adventure and learning life lessons about God along the way. This is our book. It's A Weekend at the Farm, Chapter 2. Okay, kids, is everything loaded up? Sergeant Riley hollered as he shut the tailgate of his truck. I think we have everything, replied Michael. He stood with the other kids beside Mrs. Riley's minivan. So you'll take Buddy, Michael, and Terrence? Mrs. Riley asked her husband. And you take the girls and follow behind in the van, answered Sergeant Riley. Emily and Heidi didn't mind riding with Mrs. Riley at all. That meant they would get to take care of Katie, Buddy's little sister. Now be careful, Sergeant Riley told his wife. The roads are still pretty slick. Sergeant Riley prayed, and then they were on their way. Winding through the afternoon traffic and finally out into the highway that would lead them to the farm. How long will it take to get there? Michael asked from the back seat of Sergeant Riley's truck. Only about 45 minutes, came the answer. Half hour on the highway and then about 15 minutes on the country back roads. The highway will be pretty easy driving, but the smaller roads might get more difficult with all the snow. The country roads were not as bad as Sergeant Riley thought they would be, and soon they were bumping along a gravel driveway between smooth fields of snow. At the end of the long driveway was a cluster of buildings, an old farmhouse on the right, a long, low shed straight ahead with a tractor parked in one end, and a big white barn to the left. Here we are, Sergeant Riley said, stepping out of the truck. Home, sweet home. Did you grow up here, Sergeant Riley? Asked Terrence, looking around. Yep. I know this place like the back of my hand. Well, let's get everything unloaded and in the house. Gravel crunched as Mrs. Riley and the girls drove in the minivan. Heidi and Emily climbed out and then turned back to help unbuckle the baby. I'll carry her in, said Emily, carefully lifting Katie out of her seat. May I, Mrs. Riley? Of course. If you'll just hang on to her for a few minutes, then I can unload the groceries. Heidi, would you help me? Sergeant Riley unlocked the front door of the old farmhouse, and the boys carried in the overnight bags. You boys will camp out down here in the parlor, Sergeant Riley told them, showing them a room to the right of the front door. Girls, if you'll go up those stairs, you'll find a guest room at the top to the left. The winter afternoon light was already angling sharply from the horizon as Heidi and Mrs. Riley carried the last load of groceries. Heidi, would you mind putting the chicken in the refrigerator for me? Mrs. Riley asked her. I want to go see how Emily is doing with Katie. Sure, Mrs. Riley, Heidi said, setting a heavy grocery bag on the kitchen table. Let's get to work, kids, called Sergeant Riley from the front porch. We need to get out to the barn and tend to the animals. Are you coming, Heidi? I'll be right there, Heidi answered, pulling a few cans from the top of the grocery bag. We're leaving without you, Michael yelled, slamming the screen door. I'm coming, Heidi called. She swung the grocery bag over to the counter next to the old refrigerator. She didn't want to be left behind. I'll put the stuff away when I get back, she said to herself and headed for the door. Inside the old barn, the air felt warmer and smelt of animals. 5 cows stood patiently in stalls along the side of the barn. 3 horses swung their heads curiously over the doors, of their stalls on the opposite side. At the back of the barn, a large pen held a cluster of goats pushing against their gate in hopes of getting some food. "Buddy and I'll milk the cows, since the rest of you probably don't know how," Sergeant Riley said. Taking a bucket down from a nail on the wall, Emily, you and Heidi fill the goats' feeding trough with hay. Put those from those bales over there. Terrence and Michael, grab those shovels and get to work cleaning out the horse stalls. Then we'll feed and water them. For the next hour and a half, 5 children and 1 man worked hard at caring for the animals in the barn. It was twilight when they emerged dirty and tired from the barn and made their way to the chicken coop behind the farmhouse. "What do we do here?" asked Emily, pulling her hat tighter down around her ears. "Gotta make sure all the chickens are in the coop for the night. Give them some feed and turn the heater on," Sergeant Riley told them. Because of the cold wind and the lateness of the day, all the chickens were already in the coop, roosting on their shelves above the nesting boxes. Sergeant Riley showed the children how to scatter the corn and the hay that covered the floor of the coop, and filled the feeders with grain and oyster shell. After making sure the water containers were clean and filled with fresh water, they left the chicken coop and headed back to the house. "Honey, I'm home," Sergeant Riley called as they crowded through the door into the warm lamp-lit house. "Did you pick up some milk on your way home?" joked Mrs. Riley from the kitchen where she stood with the baby on her hip. "It's outside on the porch," Sergeant Riley told her, bending to kiss her on the cheek. "Buddy, can you bring the milk in for your mother, please? It sure smells good in here. What's for supper?" "Chili and biscuits," answered his wife. "But you don't smell so great. Why don't you go get cleaned up and change into fresh clothes, and then we'll eat." Emily and Heidi ran up the steps to the little room they shared. The ceiling was low and slanted, and the lace-curtained window looked out over the porch toward the barn. Old faded wallpaper covered with yellow roses lined the walls. "I could write a book here," declared Emily, sitting down on one of the narrow beds. "It would be about the first farmer on this land, building this house and the barn and raising a family here." "We're not that far from home," Heidi said, peeking out through the curtains into the back of the country night. "But it seems like a million miles away." The delicious smell of supper drifted up the steps, and the girls hurried to clean themselves and change. When they went back down to the kitchen, they helped Mrs. Riley set the table and dish up the chili. All through the evening that followed, full of talk, laughter, and planning for tomorrow, no one noticed the grocery bag of food still out on the kitchen counter.